Jew theory, unpacking conspiracies, myths, and misconceptions. There's something insidious about how stereotypes operate, how they mutate, persist, and spread like wildfire across generations. When we examine antisemitism specifically, we discover something fascinating and disturbing. Many of its core ideas aren't exclusively about Jews at all. They're echoes of prejudice itself, archetypal patterns that get recycled across cultures and throughout history, wielded as blunt instruments against any group deemed other. Let's start with one of the most visually persistent myths, one that's probably more familiar to you than you'd like to admit. The belief that Jews have distinctively hooked noses. Think about it. Maybe you first encountered this stereotype in a school production of The Merchant of Venice. You're sitting in those uncomfortable auditorium seats, watching Shylock stride across the stage with an exaggerated prosthetic nose and hunched shoulders. Or perhaps you saw it in an old political cartoon, one of those crude caricatures from decades past. Somewhere between Shakespeare's complex character and the costume designer's choices, you absorbed an image, this notion that Jews are physically distinct, marked by prominent, hawk-like features. This imagery didn't just appear out of nowhere. Over centuries, a very specific caricature of what a Jew looks like has crystallized in Western imagination. And it goes beyond just the nose. Sometimes you'll hear claims about elongated necks, stooped postures, or other exaggerated features. These supposed physical traits have been weaponized in drawings and satirical works for generations, designed to make Jews appear alien, menacing, or inherently different from everyone else. The hooked nose became the most enduring of these markers, a grotesque shorthand for otherness. But here's the thing that might surprise you, it was never real. None of it. There is no single Jewish appearance. Modern Jews represent extraordinary genetic, ethnic, and geographic diversity, and there's a simple reason for this. Jewish history is fundamentally a story of dispersion. Jewish communities established themselves across every continent you can imagine, from the highlands of Ethiopia to the steppes of Russia, from the mountains of Yemen to the plains of Argentina. Through centuries of migration, exile, and intermarriage, the concept of an ethnically pure Jew completely dissolved, assuming it ever existed in the first place. Walk through any synagogue today and you'll see what I mean. There are black Jews, blonde Jews, Middle Eastern Jews, Asian Jews, and every possible variation in between. When someone confidently declares that Jews have hooked noses, it's worth remembering that Harrison Ford, yes, that Harrison Ford, has Jewish ancestry and pretty prominent features. The trait itself isn't exclusive to any group, yet somehow the stereotype persists with remarkable tenacity. There's actually a perfect scene in the film Exodus, Gods and Kings that illustrates this beautifully. A British officer, supremely confident in his ability to identify Jews by sight, boasts to his colleagues that he could spot one from across any room. He's that guy we all know, the one who thinks he can read people like books. Later in the film, when another officer asks him to help remove something from his eye, our confident friend leans in obligingly, performing this intimate little favor. He never realizes he's just helped a Jewish person. It's satire with a razor-sharp edge, exposing how the arrogance of prejudice often makes us completely blind to reality. Now let's pivot to something that might seem more straightforward but is actually far more complex. What actually makes someone Jewish? This is where things get really interesting, because even here, common assumptions prove wrong. In most cultures around the world, lineage gets traced through the father. That's the patrilineal model that dominates societies everywhere. But Jewish tradition operates completely differently. In rabbinic law, it's maternal descent that determines Jewish identity. A child is considered Jewish if their mother is Jewish, or if they've formally converted to Judaism. Why this focus on the mother? Well, some scholars point to scriptural precedent. There's a passage in Leviticus that describes a man born to a Jewish mother and an Egyptian father, yet the text still identifies him as one of the Israelites. This seemingly minor detail carried enormous weight over the centuries, with rabbinic authorities citing it as precedent for maternal descent. But others offer a more practical, anthropological explanation. While paternity could be uncertain, especially in pre-modern societies where travel was common and record-keeping spotty, maternity remained almost always verifiable. in a tradition that places immense value on lineage and identity, tracing descent through the mother provided certainty. More importantly, this system reflected how Jews historically navigated survival as a people without a state. Think about this for a moment. For over 2,000 years, Jews lived without a homeland. They scattered across the globe, wandered from place to place, faced expulsion after expulsion, endured persecution, forced assimilation, and countless acts of resistance. In the absence of formal governmental institutions or permanent territories, families became the primary preservers of identity. And within those families, it was particularly the mothers who carried this responsibility. Jewish education didn't happen in grand institutions or formal schools. It happened in kitchens, around dinner tables, transmitted through lullabies sung at bedtime, customs practiced during holidays, and quiet lessons shared between generations. The mother served as the anchor of continuity, the keeper of traditions that might otherwise have been lost to history. But here's another question that often surprises people: can anyone become Jewish? The answer is yes, but it's neither simple nor casual. Conversion to Judaism requires rigorous study, deep introspection, interviews with rabbinical authorities, ritual immersions called mikvahs, and often years of preparation. It's not like joining a gym or switching phone carriers. But once someone completes this demanding process, they are fully Jewish, religiously and legally. Under Israel's law of return, such individuals are even eligible for Israeli citizenship. Yet here's where things get really fascinating. Being Jewish doesn't necessarily mean practicing Judaism actively. Among American Jews under 30, approximately 40% identify as atheists or agnostics. They don't believe in God, yet they remain Jewish. This challenges any simple notion that Jewishness is solely about religion. It's simultaneously a culture, a history, and an identity that often transcends faith entirely. So how many Jews exist in the world today? The number might surprise you: approximately 14 to 15 million worldwide. That's it. For all the attention, all the conspiracy theories, all the cultural influence attributed to Jewish people, we're talking about roughly the population of Guatemala or Cambodia. And contrary to what many people assume, most Jews don't live in Israel. The United States actually hosts the world's largest Jewish population, roughly 46% of the global total. Together, the US and Israel account for about 3/4 of all Jews worldwide. The remaining communities are scattered across continents, from Canada to Argentina, France to South Africa, Australia to Iran. Europe, once the beating heart of Jewish civilization, now houses only about 10% of the world's Jews. The Holocaust devastated these communities beyond measure, destroying not just lives but entire worlds of culture, learning, and tradition. What genocide didn't destroy was often lost to fear and disillusionment in the decades that followed. Today, France maintains Europe's largest Jewish population, but it represents merely a shadow of what once flourished across the continent. Despite this complex, scattered, and remarkably diverse reality, the popular imagination continues to cling to oddly persistent, strangely uniform ideas about the Jew. We encounter claims about controlling global finance, possessing mysterious intelligence, or obsessing over money. These images, contradictory, dehumanizing, often completely absurd, lack any factual foundation. Many were shaped by selective media representations, cultural self-caricature, or the hostile imaginations of those seeking convenient scapegoats for complex social problems. The truth, as always, is far more nuanced and infinitely more human. Jewish identity cannot be recognized in a face, decoded from a name, or assumed from a profession. It is complex, resilient, and above all, profoundly human in its diversity and contradictions. As we move forward in this series, we'll explore how these myths evolved, how conspiracy theories were constructed and circulated, and how they continue to shape perceptions today. But for now, we begin with this fundamental truth: behind every stereotype lies not reality, but humanity's tendency to simplify what is beautifully, irreducibly complex. Jewish identity, like all human identity, deserves to be understood on its own terms, not through the distorted lens of prejudice that has clouded our vision for far too long. When did Jews first arrive in America? If you're like most people, you might assume it's a relatively modern story, maybe something that began in the 20th century. But the reality is far more complex and starts much earlier than you'd expect. Jewish presence in what would become the United States actually dates back to the 17th century. Picture this: while the Pilgrims were still establishing Plymouth Colony, Jewish settlers were already making their way to the New World. But their numbers remained relatively small for centuries, scattered individuals and families seeking opportunity in a vast, developing continent. Then came a turning point that would change everything. In the late 19th century, the tide shifted dramatically. Waves of persecution swept across Europe, particularly targeting Eastern European Jewish communities. Jews living in places like Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and Germany faced something we can barely imagine today: relentless violence, systematic discrimination, and mass displacement that made daily life nearly impossible. What happened next was one of the largest voluntary migrations in human history. Beginning in the 1880s and continuing into the early 20th century, millions of Jews sought refuge across the Atlantic. They packed their lives into suitcases, said goodbye to everything they'd ever known, and bet their futures on a country that promised something their homelands couldn't: the possibility of safety. This massive wave of immigration didn't just add numbers to America's population, it fundamentally reshaped the country's demographic landscape. These weren't just statistics on a ship's manifest, these were families carrying traditions, languages, skills, and dreams that would become woven into the very fabric of American culture. Here's something that might surprise you. Despite making up only about 2% of the US population today, Jews have left an absolutely indelible mark on American society. This tiny minority didn't just integrate into American life, they helped redefine what American life could be. But here's where things get really interesting, and where a lot of people's assumptions fall apart. Contrary to what you might expect, American Jews are often less religious than the general public. According to a 2021 study, only 12% of American Jews attend religious services weekly. Compare that to 27% of American Christians. Let that sink in for a moment. Yet religion still plays a crucial role in Jewish identity, just not in the way most people imagine. Many Jews identify as Jewish not because they're lighting candles every Friday night or keeping kosher, but because of family heritage, cultural traditions, or a deep connection to their ancestry that transcends religious practice. You know those images you see in movies or on TV? The Orthodox Jews with long beards, black hats, and distinctive clothing? They represent a small minority within the Jewish community. The average American Jew looks nothing like that stereotype. They're far more likely to be secular, politically liberal, and completely integrated into mainstream American society. But here's where the story gets complicated, because with visibility often comes suspicion. Jews have been caught in this bizarre double bind for generations, simultaneously praised as brilliant and successful, yet accused of manipulation or wielding some kind of sinister influence behind the scenes. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because they're pretty striking. Jews make up around 2% of the global population, yet they account for roughly 25% of Nobel Prize winners. In scientific categories, that number jumps to over 30%. These are simply facts, but watch what happens when they get filtered through stereotypes. Even achievements can be twisted into something suspicious. It's the same flawed logic that produces statements like Asians are good at math. Sounds like a compliment, right? But it carries this weight of expectation and othering that turns individuals into representatives of their entire group. Nobody wins when we think this way. The financial success statistics are equally striking and equally misunderstood. Among households in the US earning more than $200,000 a year, what we'd consider high income, only about 4% of Americans qualify. Among Jewish Americans, that number exceeds 20%. Jews are statistically more likely to be college-educated and middle to upper middle class. But here's the crucial point that gets lost in all the conspiracy theories: these figures don't reflect some kind of innate traits or genetic advantages. They speak to something entirely different: cultural values that emphasize education, tight-knit family structures that support individual achievement, and a long historical experience of turning adversity into resilience. This success has also translated into political influence. Jewish Americans' social engagement, educational achievements, and financial contributions have helped shape America's enduring support for Israel. Now, it's important to note that not all Jews are Zionist, and certainly not all are religious, but the emotional and historical ties to Israel remain undeniable for many in the community. Now let's step back into history and confront one of the oldest and most dangerous accusations ever leveled at Jewish people. It's an idea that has fueled centuries of religious antisemitism, justified countless acts of violence, and continues to poison minds today: the charge that Jews killed Jesus Christ. On its surface, this might seem like a purely theological statement, something for religious scholars to debate. But it has been weaponized as justification for hatred, violence, and systematic exclusion for nearly 2,000 years. The narrative comes from the Gospels, and if you grew up in a Christian household, you probably know the story. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, reportedly saw Jesus as innocent but succumbed to pressure from the crowd, who demanded crucifixion. In the story, Pilate literally washes his hands of guilt, and the crowd responds with words that would echo through history: "His blood be on us and on our children." That single line was taken, over centuries, as a sweeping condemnation of all Jews, past and future. Entire communities were held responsible for an event that happened 2,000 years ago, involving people they'd never met, in a place many had never seen. But this interpretation ignores several critical historical facts. First, and most obviously, Jesus was Jewish. He was born in what is now Israel, lived as a practicing Jew, preached within the Jewish tradition, and was followed by Jewish disciples. The foundational figures of Christianity, the apostles, the early church leaders, were all Jewish. The idea of blaming Jews for killing a Jewish preacher followed by Jewish disciples is, when you think about it, completely absurd. Second, the method of execution tells us everything we need to know about who was really responsible. Crucifixion was uniquely Roman. It wasn't a Jewish form of capital punishment. It was specifically designed by the Roman Empire as a public, humiliating way to execute criminals and political dissidents. So even if some Jewish authorities were involved in the trial, the final decision and the actual execution were carried out by the occupying Roman government. Blaming all Jews for the death of Jesus isn't just theologically questionable, it's historically inaccurate and logically inconsistent. But let's talk about another stereotype that has even deeper historical roots: the idea that Jews are greedy, obsessed with money, or somehow naturally cunning in financial matters. Where did this image come from? Because the answer reveals something important about how economic systems can create and perpetuate prejudice. In medieval Christian Europe, Jews faced systematic marginalization that was both legal and social. They were barred from owning land, forbidden from joining most guilds, and excluded from universities and professions. Think about what this means: farming, military service, public office, most trades and crafts, essentially every normal path to making a living was closed to them. But here's the twist. One profession remained open: moneylending. Christians at the time considered lending money with interest to be sinful, a violation of religious law. But society still needed loans, credit, and financial services. Commerce couldn't function without them. So Jews were pushed, often forcibly, into filling that role. Over time, their presence in finance became exaggerated, vilified, and mythologized. They became convenient scapegoats whenever economic hardship hit. People owed money to Jewish lenders? Blame the Jews. Market crashed? Must be Jewish manipulation. It was a perfect setup for resentment. Here's what's crucial to understand: these roles weren't chosen out of greed or some natural affinity for money. They were forced by systematic exclusion. Jews made a way to survive where no legitimate path was given to them. And then that resilience, that ability to adapt and succeed despite persecution, was turned into an accusation against them. From these distorted historical views, an entire tangled web of prejudice formed, one that continues to influence how people think about, talk about, and fear Jewish people today. But when you actually look at the history, when you examine the facts rather than the myths, you find a very different story. It's a story of migration and adaptation, of communities finding ways to survive and thrive despite centuries of systematic oppression. And that story is far from over. In our next episode, we'll explore how these ancient prejudices evolved into modern conspiracy theories, and how they continue to shape perceptions in ways that might surprise you. Here's something that might surprise you: the Bible actually prohibits lending money at interest. This wasn't just a Christian thing either. Judaism had the same rule. But history? Well, history had other plans. Picture medieval Europe. If you were Jewish, you couldn't own land. You couldn't farm. You couldn't join the military or most trade guilds. Christians had literally pushed Jews out of almost every profession, except the ones they considered beneath them. Commerce. Finance. Money lending. It's almost darkly ironic. Christians called these professions impure and dishonorable, but then forced Jews into them as their only means of survival. For centuries, Jews were practically the only people legally allowed to lend money with interest. But here's where it gets interesting and dangerous. By the 13th century, everything changed. The Crusades were winding down, Italian city-states like Florence and Venice were rising to power, and suddenly the church's rules about money lending, well, they got a lot more flexible. Christian moneylenders entered the game, and they went after the wealthy clients, the safe bets. That left Jews serving the riskiest borrowers, people without collateral, without credit, without options. And risky loans? They come with higher interest rates. You can probably see where this is heading. When those debts couldn't be repaid, guess who got blamed? Not the economic system. Not the circumstances. The Jews. This is where one of literature's most damaging characters enters our story, Shylock, from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. Cruel, vengeful, obsessed with money. Every anti-Semitic stereotype rolled into one character. But here's the kicker: Shakespeare had probably never met a single Jewish person in his entire life. England had expelled all its Jews in 1290, and they wouldn't be legally allowed back for over 350 years. Think about that. The stereotypes were so powerful, so embedded in European culture, that they survived even when there were no Jews around to contradict them. Shakespeare wasn't alone. Balzac, Dickens, major authors were trafficking in these same tired tropes, spreading them to millions of readers. Fast forward to today, and we're still seeing the same playbook. Economic crisis? Blame the Jews. Social unrest? Blame the Jews. Global pandemic? You guessed it. The details change, but the scapegoating remains exactly the same. And here's what's fascinating about Jewish history: it's been a constant cycle of integration and expulsion, acceptance and persecution. After centuries of oppression, Jewish communities finally started integrating into European societies during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Enlightenment was happening, religious empires were crumbling, and for a moment, it looked like things might actually get better. But then nationalism arrived. When Italy and Germany unified in the 1860s and 1870s, the modern nation-state was born. And with it came a new, exclusionary idea of identity. One based on blood, language, and geography. Jews, who had been scattered across Europe for centuries and maintained their distinct culture, suddenly became the perfect other. Once again, they were scapegoated. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in Russia. Jews were blamed, despite having absolutely no connection to the crime. The result? Violent pogroms swept across the country. But this wasn't new. In the 14th century, when the Black Death was killing millions across Europe, Jews were accused of poisoning wells. When children went missing, rumors of Jewish ritual murder spread like wildfire. The details changed, but the pattern was always the same: find a crisis, blame the Jews. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said something profound about this: it is not the Jewish character that creates the antisemite, but the antisemite who creates the Jew. What he meant was that antisemitism has nothing to do with actual Jewish people or their behavior. It's a projection. Society creates a villain first, then fills in the details later to justify its hatred. Which brings us to the 20th century, and Adolf Hitler. When people hear anti-Semitism, they immediately think of the Holocaust. But here's what's crucial to understand: Hitler didn't invent anti-Semitism. He inherited it. Centuries of religious prejudice, economic scapegoating, and nationalist hatred, he just weaponized it more effectively than anyone before him. When Hitler rose to power in 1933, many German Jews thought they were safe. They had fought for Germany in World War I, earned military honors, become doctors, lawyers, artists. They had assimilated. They thought they were Germans first, Jews second. They were tragically wrong. This is just the beginning of a much larger story. One that connects ancient prejudices to modern hatred, and shows us why understanding this history has never been more important. The Holocaust was not just a genocide. It was a meticulously organized, bureaucratic system of extermination, cloaked in secrecy and disguised with chilling efficiency. One of the most horrifying aspects was how many Jews went silently to their deaths in gas chambers. There are many analyses about why that was the case. Among the most devastating is this: resistance was met with terror so extreme, so deliberately sadistic, that it broke the will to fight. Nazi guards were known to torture children in front of their parents, to crush limbs with stones, to invent methods of psychological devastation. Jews were dehumanized not only in death, but in the very anticipation of it. In that way, the Holocaust didn't just attempt to kill a people. It tried to destroy their spirit. And yet, the Holocaust did not erase Jewish identity. It reshaped it. For many Jews, survival came at the cost of immense trauma. For the rest of humanity, it left behind a legacy of guilt, one that, to this day, remains unresolved in many corners of the world. The rise of Hitler was not a historical accident. He was not simply an evil man who happened to gain power. He rode a wave of nationalism, economic despair, and long-standing anti-Semitic narratives that already saturated European consciousness. He didn't invent hatred. He merely fanned its flames into an inferno. And then, after the war, when 6 million had been murdered and countless others displaced, something unbelievable began to circulate. Conspiracy theories. The claim that Jews were secretly plotting to take over the world. That no Jews died in the 9/11 attacks. That Mossad, or the CIA, orchestrated the event to deepen anti-Muslim sentiment in the West. These theories are not rooted in reality. They are rooted in bias. They offer a twisted kind of comfort, a clear villain, a simple explanation. But what they really reflect is confirmation bias. Take the stereotype: Jews only care about money. If a wealthy Jewish person runs a defense company, the conspiracy theorist says, "See? Proof." But if a wealthy French person does the same, their ethnicity is never mentioned. It's not the fact. It's the filter. Conspiracy theories thrive on this kind of selective logic. They're built by stitching together unrelated facts until a pattern appears, one that supports a predetermined story. It's no different from people who believe the moon landing was faked. It's not that there's zero evidence. It's that the overall picture, the broader context, is ignored in favor of a sensational conclusion. Now, let me be clear: discussing anti-Semitism, or debunking anti-Semitic conspiracies, is not the same as defending Israeli government policy. These are two separate conversations. Yes, the current situation in Gaza and the occupied territories deserves scrutiny, outrage, and global pressure. The disproportionate violence, the suffering of Palestinians, the policies of occupation, these are real and unacceptable. But acknowledging that reality does not justify centuries of prejudice against Jews. And opposing anti-Semitism does not require defending everything the State of Israel does. Which brings us to one of the most infamous conspiracy documents in history, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It claimed to be a record of secret Jewish meetings, where plans were laid to dominate the world through chaos, liberalism, and the erosion of national identities. It described Jews as puppet masters engineering global disorder in order to seize control. But the Protocols was not a secret document. It was fiction. literary scholars traced it back to a German novel published in the 1860s titled Biarritz, which included a fictional scene of Jews meeting in a cemetery to plot world domination. Over decades, this fictional scene was rewritten, translated, and presented as fact. By 1905, it had become the so-called Protocols, a fabricated document embraced by Tsarist Russia, Nazi Germany, and even some circles today. It's a perfect example of how anti-Semitic narratives mutate over time. In the 19th century, Jews were blamed for capitalism, moneylenders, bankers, financiers. But with the rise of communism, Jews were suddenly blamed for that too. They were accused of undermining capitalism by promoting revolution. You can't have it both ways. But anti-Semitic logic doesn't care about coherence. People pointed to Marx, who had Jewish roots, or Trotsky, or even Lenin, claiming they were evidence of a Jewish communist conspiracy. But in truth, Jews had been both capitalist and communist, liberal and conservative, revolutionary and establishment. They were blamed for both sides of the same conflict. This is the intellectual absurdity of anti-Semitism. It is a worldview constructed entirely out of contradiction, paranoia, and projection. Some might hear all this and say, "Are you defending Jews just to defend Israel?" But again, this misses the point. This conversation isn't about geopolitics. It's about prejudice, how it forms, how it spreads, and why it must be challenged. I've spent years reading and revisiting books on this subject. And I've found that what's most dangerous about anti-Semitism is not just its brutality, but its persistence. Its ability to shapeshift, to adapt to the times, and to infect people who otherwise think of themselves as rational. If you're interested in exploring this further, let me recommend a film. There are many Holocaust films, but there's one lesser-known gem I always return to, a Polish film called Light in the Darkness. It's a quiet, devastating story about the Holocaust, tender, tragic, and deeply human. It reminds us that behind every historical headline, every statistic, every stereotype, there are people. Families. Children. Lives. Thank you for listening.